Let the scriptures speak for themselves.
But James, I'd love to hear kind of you walking us through, if you would, your views and understanding of from the time it was written to maybe walking through, and of course, some of these things we're not going to have clear answers to, right? We're not going to have hard evidence for, but even so, I'd love to hear your views and then kind of walk us through why it was written, when it was written, and your understanding. And then from there, I think something that was really helpful in your book as well, you talked a little bit about where the text maybe went off, if you would say, where the corruption maybe would have been brought in, where this was extracted. And I've heard different things from different authors. Some point to Gnosticism, some point to Egypt. I know you mentioned Egypt in your book, and then down to Eusebius, as he is looking through his copies, we get that famous quote where he gives a twofold possible answer to the problem, which has been used, right, to say that he was claiming something that I don't think he was claiming. I don't know if you would think he was claiming that. But anyways, if you could just walk us through that chronology to understand your view of what happened and how it happened, that would be, I think, really helpful to give people a mental picture of this timeline.
Okay. Well, we can go back to the hypothesis about why is Mark 16:9-20 in the Gospel of Mark. And in lectures, in lectures 16 and 17 that I have online in my textual criticism course, there are more details that are given there. But my basic idea, this is the hypothesis that I promote, is that as Mark was writing the Gospel of Mark, this is happening in Rome. Mark's already been the secretary / gopher for Peter for a while, and he's already collected a good number of Peter's episodes about Jesus. But now, Peter's not getting any younger. The church is in danger. Nero is aggressively attacking the church, and people are asking Peter, could we get this written down on parchment or on papyri, this record of your recollections about Jesus? And so Peter has already given many of these stories. And if you look at the Gospel of Mark, it doesn't answer all the questions that Matthew or Luke does. Peter wasn't around to see the birth of Jesus. And so in Mark, we don't have a birth story about Jesus. We mainly see things, not entirely, but mainly we see things that happened when Peter or somebody that was a close associate of Peter was on the scene. And so Mark sits down to make this definitive record of Peter's recollections about Jesus. And as he's doing so, toward the end, he gets to what we know as chapter 16, verse 8, and he's permanently interrupted. Now, does that mean that he had to catch a ship for Alexandria? Does it mean that he was martyred? We don't know. We don't have videotape, as I like to say. But his colleagues were entrusted with what was left, and they recognized that Mark's text of that just ends there with they were, because they were afraid at the end. That was not a finished manuscript. So what choice do they have? The choice number one would be, well, we can release it like that, or they could have, or we could say, well, choice two would be, let's write our own ending. But there was another choice. I find it very unlikely that Mark would have been in the church at Rome for any amount of time, and the church would not be celebrating the resurrection of Jesus every year. And so what I think happened is that they took a pre-existing, freestanding record of the post-resurrection appearances of Christ, and even though it didn't match on like a glove, it was close enough that it would conclude the account. And so Mark 16:9-20, that was a pre-existing record of those post-resurrection appearances of Jesus by Mark, was blended on to the unfinished, the otherwise unfinished record that Mark had written. And in that form, they began to make copies of that text. It was only until after this record of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances that the Gospel of Mark, its production stage ceased and its transmission stage began. That's usually the way that people describe or define what the original text means. For instance, we have the book of Proverbs, which is not just the work of one person. You can see in chapter 30 and chapter 31, certainly, that's written by other people. And in the Psalms, we have some Psalms by this person, some Psalms for that person. It doesn't depend on being a work by one person. Even in the book of Romans, there's that one little verse by that Tertius throws in there. And at the end of the Gospel of John, there at the end we have this mixture of we know that his testimony is true, and also that final verse, that presents like it's another extra little note. And so if in that form, that's how it began, at some point it would reach somebody on their way to Egypt. And that person might say, wait a minute, we don't know this as the Gospel of Mark. We know this as the resurrection. We know this as the Recollections of Peter about Jesus. So this extra little thing here, this is not Petrine. And because of that doubt being raised in the Alexandrian transmission line, or what became the Alexandrian transmission line, that was excised. They would rather have just what comes from Peter. And there was even a scribal tendency to say we only want to keep what comes from the main source. This extra little thing from Mark is like a postscript or something unauthorized. It's not really got the authority of Peter behind it. And so in the Alexandrian transmission line, pretty early in the transmission line, that was excised. But in the Alexandrian transmission line, a little later on, they get tired of just stopping the text. They recognize, hey, nobody ends a narrative like this. Now you might end a speech like this, and we see that being done in Plato. But end a narrative like this, it's unheard of. And so ending a narrative like that with Gar was unique. And eventually somebody said, yeah, we need something more here. We need to wrap up the narrative. And so somebody wrote what is known as the shorter ending. That is a brief way to wrap up the narrative. And we see that in 6 Greek manuscripts. Now, in versional manuscripts like the Boharic and the Ethiopic, things that were influenced later on by the Alexandrian transmission line, we see oodles and noodles. But along with verses 9 to 20. But in Greek, we only have six Greek manuscripts that support that ending. Now, that ending has made it into the footnotes of some modern translations, even though it's supported by only 6 manuscripts, and nobody thinks that the shorter ending is original. It doesn't look Markan, it doesn't sound Markan, and yet it is in there. A man named Salmon, George Salmon, back in the 1800s, after Westcott and Hort had made their theories about it, he spoken up and said, well, I think the situation here, the reason why they give attention to the shorter ending, even though everybody knows that this is not genuine, it's kind of like that. Once upon a time, there was a duke who was having this party, and he invited the plumber, and his wife was like, why are you inviting the plumber? And so she invited the milkman, so that when the plumber got to the party, he wouldn't feel really, really good about himself. So I think that's kind of the situation that we have when those who reject Mark 16:9 to 20 are kind of throwing in the shorter ending, just so the milkman won't, just so the other guy won't feel bad.